want to welcome everyone to our class. Um, let's see, make sure we're recording here. And this is for the August 8th Sunday service. We're studying through, again, the book of First Kings, and I'm going to be pulling up the slide deck here. And we can get started. We are studying through the book of First Kings, as I mentioned, chapters 12 and 13. We have a significant transition this week with Solomon has now died, and his son Rehoboam is now emerging as the king, but there is going to be a split in the kingdom. And as I turn to the slide deck, we have had many lessons, where we have talked about the amazing United Kingdom under David and Solomon, and very expansive kingdom, and all of the countries in the area, Moab, Ammon, down to the border of Egypt, Philistia, Phoenicia, all of these, northern Syria, the Arameans, all under complete control of David, and then Solomon or Solomon. Unfortunately, we're going to see a split that occurs between Judah and Israel. The two kingdoms will emerge. Many of these satellite countries that David had conquered will gain independence, especially Aram. And this will later really plague Israel and Judah as a severe enemy. And so Aram, Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, all of these countries that David had conquered will reemerge very powerfully. Again, if we look at Jerusalem, he has now completed, meaning Solomon, the great expansion of his temple and the citadel. North of Zion, Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. And as we have talked through several chapters, quite a complex, this amazing 10th century BCE wall has now been discovered architecturally in Jerusalem. And it is an amazing thing to see after all of these centuries and millennia, the hard archaeological evidence of what Solomon kingdom built and as described in the scriptures. I want to put forward a very important archaeological milestone, and that is the Pharaoh, known in the scriptures as Shishak, literally on the temple wall there at Karnak in Lower Egypt, or I'm sorry, Upper Egypt, Shishak. And on that temple, a great history of his reign. And we're going to be, we talked about him last week. We're going to mention again his involvement politically with this now disintegrating empire of David and Solomon. And he plays an incredibly important historical role in the storyline. And so Shishak, or Shishonk, as is the Egyptian pronunciation, is very, very critical in pinning down the historicity of this narrative. And a little bit about him, I'll repeat this again. Shishak, or Shishonk, is the first Egyptian king to be mentioned by name in the Bible. Pharaoh at the time of Abraham, all through the patriarchs. Moses, always just simply called Pharaoh. And Pharaoh simply means in Egyptian, the great house. It's not a name. It's not even really a title. It's a way to describe this immense power. It's the great house. And so no other Pharaoh by name is mentioned in the Bible until Shishak or Shishonk. And because of that, we now can really pin down what's going on with Solomon's life. Solomon collaborated with Pharaoh Shamun, that's the Pharaoh right before Shishak, and arranged to marry his daughter. Now, he was a very weak king, very weak. And this is why he allowed a daughter of Pharaoh, to be sent off to be Solomon's wife. That really never occurred before with any of the strong pharaonic dynasties. Solomon then reinforced Gitzer with strong double walls and his six-chamber gates. Now, this six-chamber gate is going to be a hallmark of, again, archaeologically proving the authenticity of the Solomonic empire and reign, because it is a copy of what's going on as we see gates of that period in Egypt. And so it is no coincidence that Solomon, aligning himself with the Pharaoh of Egypt, begins to build big monumental architecture, and he uses, and perhaps even, we don't know, but perhaps even hired architects up from Egypt to make sure the fortifications and the gate works were similar to what you see in Egypt. Solomon then reinforced Gitzer with strong double walls and his six-chamber gates, as he also did at Megiddo, Hatzor, and Jerusalem, 1 Kings 9:15. Jeroboam fled from Solomon to Shishak in Egypt, 1 Kings 11:40. We covered that last week, who welcomed him and gave his wife's sister to Mary. When Solomon died in 930 BC, Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. Jeroboam returned to Shechem the same year and became king of the northern tribes of Israel. In 925 BC, Shishak invaded Canaan and took away the treasures of Jerusalem, including all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. 1 Kings 14. Now, we're going to cover this especially next week when we actually read the narrative about the invasion and the balance of weight of what that represents. And then the balance that is written on the temple of Shishak. In other words, your Bible says he did it and he took so many shields. And we actually know what the weight of all those shields are because it's recorded earlier by in David's narrative. And then we know on the temple at Karnak, Shishak describes how much weight of gold he took out of Canaan and Jerusalem. And they're within pounds, literally within pounds. And it's a stunning archaeological underpinning of the veracity of our scriptures. So that's the reason why I want to highlight this Pharaoh, very important historically. Shishak, they have not only his written deeds of his reign on the temple there at Karnak, but also his sarcophagus, his mummy, and his death mask, many really effective material evidence. And then we're going to stop there and go to the text because we've got to get into what happens. So our text will tell us what is happening. So let me switch out here and then we can begin. And then we're going to take some pauses for certainly some discussions. 1 Kings chapter 12. Rehoboam, that's Rehoboam, or I'm sorry, that's Jeroboam, went to Shechem, where all Israel had come to proclaim him king. Rehoboam is Rehoboam, went to Shechem, where all Israel came to proclaim him king. When Jeroboam, the son of Nevat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from Sholomon. So Jeroboam was living in Egypt, but they sent and summoned him. Jeroboam and the whole community of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father laid a harsh yoke on us. But if you will lighten the harsh service we had to render your father and ease his heavy yoke that he put on us, we will serve you." And so here is a moment when the kingdom could have stayed unified with a little bit of common sense. He said to them, "Leave me alone for 3 days and come back to me." So the people left. King Rehoboam, that's Rehoboam, consulted the older men who had been in attendance on Sholomon his father during his lifetime and asked, "What advice would you give me as to how to answer these people?" They said to him, "If you will start today being a servant," here we go, "a servant to these people, if you will serve them, be responsive to them, and give them favorable consideration, then they will be your servants forever." In other words, if you treat the people right, they don't have any problem with you continuing to serve like your father Solomon, but you need to change your ways there, and especially your grandfather David. But he did not take the advice the older men gave. Instead, he consulted the young men he had grown up with, meaning in the court, in the posh luxury of Solomon. Uh, and he goes to them. What advice would you give me so that we can give an answer to these people who said to me, lighten the yoke that your father laid on us? The young men who had grown up with him said, these people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter for us. Here's the answer you should give them. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Boy, that is a boastful statement. Yes, my father burdened you with heavy yoke, but I will make it heavier. My father controlled you with whips, but I will control you with scorpions. What a foolish, utterly foolish thing to say to a people who are coming back under evidently a fairly harsh rule under Solomon. And as we've already studied, very preferential towards Judah, not so much the other 10 tribes. And instead of listening to even Solomon's former advisors, the older men, he listens to the rambunctious, spoiled, probably young men who he'd grown up with, and they're like, "Oh, treat him even harsher. You gotta prove who you are. You're the man. You're the king here." Let's stop there and talk about advice and what usually happens with foolish, prideful, or emotionally prideful advice. I'll give you a few minutes to think on that and have a little bit of a discussion. Okay, getting back to our text. So Jeroboam, and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, and as the king had requested by saying, "Come to me again the third day." And the king answered the people harshly, abandoning the advice the older men had given him. He addressed them according to the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father controlled you with whips, but I will control you with scorpions." So the king didn't listen to the people, and that was something Adonai brought about. Who brought this about? Adonai. Let that young man get a prideful heart and a mouthy tongue, so that he could fulfill his word, which Adonai had spoken through Achiah from Shiloh to Jeroboam the son of Nevat. When all Israel saw that the king wasn't listening to them, the people answered the king, "Do we have any share in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Ishai or Jesse. Go to your tents, Israel. Care for your own house, David." So Israel left for their tents. And of course, that is as a colloquialism for their homes. In other words, we are ending this covenantal relationship. This alliance is over. But as for the people of Israel living in the cities of Yehudah, Rehoboam ruled over them. King Rehoboam then sent Adoram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. Wow. King Rehoboam managed to mount his chariot and flee to Jerusalem. Israel has been in rebellion against the dynasty of David to this day. On hearing that Jeroboam had returned, all Israel summoned him to the assembly and proclaimed him king over Israel. No one followed the dynasty of David except for the tribe of Yehudah. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he assembled the house of Yehudah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 select soldiers, to fight the house of Israel and bring the rulership back to Rehoboam, the son of Sholomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. "Speak to Rehoboam, the son of Sholomon, the king of Yehudah, to all the house of Yehudah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people. Tell them that this is what Adonai says. You are not to go up and fight your brothers, the people of Israel. Every man is to go back home, because this is my doing." They paid attention to the word of Adonai and turned back as Adonai had told them. Now, I got to give credit to Rehoboam for being a prideful, foolish young king. He at least listened to God's prophet, and he did not cause an immediate, massive civil war to break out between these tribal, family. And he listened finally to that prophet, and it saved, I think, a colossal loss of life. And God made it very clear. There's two things that are very interesting. The narrative tells us all of this is caused by, and it is the will of Adonai that it happens this way. The other thing interesting is it's not Adonai that affirms and gives to Jeroboam, the kingship. It is the Israelites who say, "You are our king," and this is a huge difference between what Saul experienced, David experienced, and Solomon experienced. This is a people's politic versus God providing that stamp, that approval, that anointing. He could never say, "I am the anointed of Israel." He wasn't anointed by anybody. They elected him, if you will. They chose him to be king. And then let's take a quick look at the rest of 12. Then Yerovam built up Shechem in the hills of Ephraim and lived there. After that, he left and built up Penuel. That's where Yaakov or Jacob had gone through hundreds of years earlier. Nevertheless, Yerovam said to himself, "Now the rulership will return to the house of David, for if these people continue going up to offer sacrifices in the house of Adonai and Jerusalem, their hearts will turn back to their Lord, Rakavim, the king of Yehuda. Then they will kill me and return to Rakavim, king of Yehuda." After seeking advice, the king made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, "You've been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." He placed one at Bethel and the other at Dan. And the affair became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one in Bethel and all the way to Dan to worship the other. He also set up temples on the high places and made Kohanim from among all the people. In other words, anybody that he wanted, okay, you're a priest, even though they were not descended from Levi or Levi. Yerovam instituted a festival in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, similar to the festival held in Yehuda. He went up to the altar of Bethel to sacrifice to the calves he had made, and he placed in Bethel the Kohanim, the priests he had appointed for the high places. He went up to the altar which he had set up in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had chosen on his own and instituted a festival for the people of Israel. He went up to the altar to burn incense. And so once he becomes king, elected by the Israelites, not anointed by God, he's like any political leader. He goes, "Oh, my power base will weaken by influence if the Israelites continue to go south into Judah, Yehuda, and they worship at the temple that God had instituted at Jerusalem. Well, I can't have that, so I'm going to seek advice." Well, what advice is he given? Political advice, not spiritual advice. So he sets up these 2 locations. Bethel is kind of in the southern part of his territory, Israel. Dan is way up in the north, very convenient for the people. And hey, no problem, we got priests. Where do they come from? Well, any of your tribes. We're all equal here. And what are we going to do here? Well, these are your real gods. No longer the God of Moses, of Moshe, and Joshua. This is now your gods. Two bull gods. We're gonna set them up, and it'll be great. So he makes a political decision to keep power instead of following God and trusting God. Because of that, he will lead Israel immediately into a wretched, wretched state. Okay, we're gonna zip over to the slide deck. Go back here. We're not sure exactly what they looked like, but we do have some remnants of the temple at Dan and a little bit at Bethel. And so that again is the narrative we just read. He sets up these golden calves. And if we go to the next slide, this is at Dan, way up. This picture is taken literally at the archaeological site that they have excavated, 9th century BCE. Behind that tree line literally is the starting of the territory of Lebanon. So you're as far north as you can possibly be and still be in the state of Israel. And they have found and excavated this very vast complex. Clearly there was a big altar. This is where in Dan up north, one of the golden calves was located. And they have excavated and found the horned altar that was used to make the sacrifices. And down at Bethel, they have also been able to extract or excavate the sacrificial site at Bethel. So they've been able to find these two sites that Jeroboam sets up to keep political control. He's not thinking spiritual, he's thinking political. So we're going to toggle back to the narrative and finish out the class. So these chapters are how to make really bad decisions politically. First and foremost, don't inquire about Adonai, and then by all means do what you think your advisors tell you to do. And then look what happens. So let's get into 1 Kings 13, very interesting chapter. Just then, Jeroboam was standing by the altar to burn incense. A man of God came out of Yehuda, directed to Bethel by a word from Adonai. And by the word from Adonai, he cried out against the altar, "Altar, altar, hear us what Adonai says. A son will be born to the house of David. His name will be Yoshiahu," that's Josiah. "And on you he will sacrifice the Kohanim of the high places who burn incense on you. They will burn human bones on you. That same day he will also give you a sign. Here is the sign which Adonai has decreed. The altar will be split apart. The ashes on it will be scattered about." Very powerful prophecy about the great King Josiah coming hundreds of years later. When the king heard what the man of God said and how he denounced the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam took his hand away from the altar and said, "Seize him." But his hand, the one he stretched out against him, shriveled up so that he could not draw it back to himself. Hey, be careful when you're dealing with God's prophet. Also, the altar was split apart, and the ashes scattered from the altar according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of Adonai. The king then responded to the man of God, "Ask now the favor of Adonai, your God," not my God, your God. Wow, that's telling. He said, "And pray for me that my hand will be restored to me." The man of God prayed to Adonai, and the king's hand was restored to him because as it had been before. How merciful of God to do that. The king then said to the man of God, "Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward." But the man of God replied to the king, "Even if you give me half your household, I will not accept your hospitality, nor will I eat food or drink water in this place. For this is the order I received through the word of Adonai. Don't eat food or drink water. Don't return by the road you took when you came." So he went another way and did not return by the road which he had come to Bethel. So God is very powerfully already rebuking Jeroboam and his decision to make this foreign and pathetic altar to God. And yet Adonai is even merciful. He wants his people to return to him. "Oh, King Jeroboam, will you not wise up? I just shriveled your hand. I could strike you dead. Come now and get back on track." Of course, he will not, and there'll be king after king that will be led to a miserable conclusion. Let's finish out. This is a very interesting one of these interesting stories, always in the Bible. Now, there lived an old prophet in Bethel, and one of his sons came and told him all the things the man of God had done that day in Bethel. Also, they told their father what the king had said. Their father asked them, which way did he go? For his sons had seen what road the man of God from Yehuda had taken. And then he said to his son, "Saddle the donkey for me." So they settled the donkey for him, and riding on it, he went after the man of God. He found him sitting under a pistachio tree and said to him, "Are you the man of God who came up from Yehuda?" He answered, "I am." Then he said to him, "Come home with me and eat some food." He replied, "I cannot return with you or partake of your hospitality, nor will I eat food or drink water with you in this place, because it was said to me by the word of Adonai, you're not to eat food or drink or water there. You're not to go back the same way you came." The other said to him, "I too am a prophet, just like you. And an angel spoke to me by the word of Adonai. And he said, bring him back to you and your house so that he can eat food and drink water." But he was lying to him. So he went back with him and did eat food and drink water in the house. As they were sitting at the table, the word of Adonai came to the prophet who had brought him back. So here is the lying, conniving prophet who's trying to manipulate this other really good guy who just did his mission, and he's schnookered him to come to his house. But this time, Adonai actually comes to this old conniving prophet, and look what happens. Oh my gosh. As they were sitting at the table, the word of Adonai came to the prophet who had brought him back, and he cried to the man of God who had come from Yehuda. Here's what Adonai says: since you rebelled against the word of Adonai and didn't obey the mitzvah Adonai your God gave you, but came back and ate food and water and drank water in this place where you are warned not to eat food or drink water, your corpse will not arrive at the tomb of your ancestors. Wow. After he had eaten food and drunk, he saddled the donkey for the prophet he had brought back. But after he had gone, a lion encountered the man of God on the road and killed him. His corpse lay there in the road with a donkey and the lion standing next to it. Now that is quite a sight. In time, people passed by and saw the corpse lying in the road with the lion standing next to it. And they came and talked about it in the city where the old prophet lived. I guess they did. Oh my gosh. When the people who had brought him back from the road heard about it, he said, it is the man of God who rebelled against the word of the Lord. This is why Adonai handed him over to the lion to tear him to pieces and kill him, in keeping with the word Adonai spoke to him. To his sons he says, saddle the donkey for me, and they saddled it. He went and found his corpse lying in the road with the donkey and the lion standing next to the corpse. The lion had neither eaten the corpse nor attacked the donkey. The prophet picked up the corpse of the man of God, laid it on the donkey, brought it back to the city where he lived to mourn and bury him. He laid the corpse in his own burial cave, and they mourned him. Oh, my brother. After burying him, he said to his sons, when I die, put me in the burial cave, for the man of God is buried. Lay my bones next to his bones. For the thing he cried out about the word of Adonai against this altar of Bet-El, against all the temples on the high places near the cities of Shomron, will surely happen. After this, Yeroboam did not turn back from his evil way, but continued appointing Kohanim, or priests, for the high places from among the people. He consecrated anyone who wanted to be a Kohen, a priest of the high places. This brought sin to the house of Jeroboam, or Jeroboam, that would eventually cut it off and destroy it from the face of the earth. And as we close out, I just want you guys to reflect on, if ever you're given a mission for God, complete it. And even God, this is how so amazing to me, even though this old wicked, conniving old prophet causes the destruction of this other good prophet. Now, this other good prophet made, again, a fatal mistake. You fulfill the very commission that God's given you. But even so, he mourns for what he does. He has compassion on that prophet that was torn apart by the lion. He wants to be buried with him. And the two of them will become part of an overall prophecy that God will fulfill in the time of Josiah, Yeshayahu, many hundreds of years later. So amazing is God's word. I hope this has been encouraging, and think about these words. Sometimes there's these very interesting, can even be a little bit bizarre stories, but there's always deep applied spiritual principles there. We need to follow God's way. And just because things look like they make sense politically or from a power structure, if you go down that path, you will be destroyed. You have to follow the principles and the directions that God gives you. So think on these things and have a great time of worship. Appreciate always everyone participating in the class, and we'll have another great time next week. Thank you so much. Take care.